Hello everyone, today's lesson is on environmental policy and I subtitled it Webs of Meaning, Webs of Power. I guess because I think I'm just a really freaking clever professor. Just kidding. The reason that I titled it that is because it's a reference to a famous statement attributed to Max Weber by Clifford Geertz, which says that humans, or man, is himself a creature, or is a creature suspended in webs of his own making, like this idea that human beings are embedded in cultural movements, cultural ideas that motivate them, which of course come from human beings. So when we think about environmental policy, then we are thinking about something like that, right? Webs of meaning, but also webs of power, right? None of us are entirely free, right? In the context of policy, we have restrictions and regulations and things like that, which affect our environmental behaviors. It is not solely a matter of our environmental worldviews. And so, it pays to understand these structures, these conditions, which influence how people act environmentally, how their cultures act environmentally. So today, then, I have three goals. Goal number one, I would like to talk about some foundational terms and concepts. These are both terms kind of on an applied technical level of just legal policy kind of terms, as well as some theoretical terms from the literature, which I think are useful. We are going to, number two, talk about some basics of U.S. environmental law and policy. And number three, we are going to study environmental policy case studies from a few different locations, specifically Malaysia and Nepal, and along the way we might talk about a few other concepts. Yeah, and then we're going to discuss a few concepts related to those case studies, including the concept of environmentality and bureaucracy, which may not sound really cool, but it's going to be boss. So here we go. First, part one, basic terms and concepts. Okay, so I have a meme here. I did a lot of memes this lecture. I don't know, I was in a meme-like mood. Anyways, this is a classic Bon Apple tea, right? Where somebody is misunderstanding a common phrase or whatever. This person is saying lemonade when what they mean is laminate. So obviously causing a lot of confusion for the copy store worker. And it's true, right? When we don't understand the term somebody's using, or when we're using a term differently, sometimes we can run into a lot of trouble. So with that in mind, I want to cover some terms and concepts that I think are really helpful for this topic. And the first has to do with laws and policies, terms we sometimes kind of misuse, and I'm going to try to shed some light on. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does a law do, how does it do it. Now you're starting to have like flashbacks of Schoolhouse Rock if you're from like my generation. But anyways, here we go. So we want to draw a distinction when we talk about environmental topics and political ecology and things like that. We want to draw a distinction between policy and law. Policy we can think of as a government's overall sort of approach to how they're handling an issue, or it doesn't even have to be government, right? Obviously a company can have a policy, like a policy of non-discrimination. So it's the overall way we're approaching an issue. And then specifically in government, though, that becomes really important because oftentimes governments produce policy statements, such as executive orders, which presidents have been doing more and more and more of over the past few decades. In theory, an executive order, it can be very important, right? It can, in fact, be incredibly important depending on what's in it. However, when it comes to environmental law, executive orders are often only so helpful because they are more than anything a policy statement. They are the president, as the head of the executive branch, saying this is how we're going to do things as an executive branch. But of course, that president would be very much within their right to overturn that policy statement. That president may or may not actually follow that policy statement very well, and indeed attempts to use them to enforce environmental issues sometimes don't work very well because the executive orders, they're not really a binding law with teeth, right? They don't really have like a penalty for not following it. You can't sort of typically make the government like follow its own environmental executive order, right? They're more meant as a statement of what they're going to try to do, and that's important, but they usually don't have penalties attached to them like perhaps a law would. So some good examples, EO 13007, Indian Sacred Sites, which basically says that, as we've talked about before, the U.S. government will provide for the access and use of sacred sites and sacred objects by Native American practitioners. And EO 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. Basically one of the first environmental racism addressed executive orders. These can be really impactful, right? The executive branch has a lot of power. So if the executive branch says, for example, we are going to do a review of our policies to see which, if any of them, are causing environmental racism issues, that can be a really impactful thing. I'm just trying to suggest, though, that as a policy statement, it's not the same sort of strength or heaviness as like a law. Because a law, as formal legislation, first of all, it's binding, and under a variety of things in US law, including what's called the APA, if a law is not being followed by the government, including on something like land use, if they're putting in let's say a waste plant that's going to violate the Clean Water Act, and they didn't even consider the Clean Water Act and are totally going to jack up the pollution in an area from a water perspective, laws allow you, if let's say you're an advocacy group, to take that to court. And the reverse also obviously is true, right? In theory, an industry group could take government to court and say that government is being capricious in not allowing its industry group to do a certain something, right? So in a sense, these laws, we think of laws as something that the government enforces on us, and that's very much true. But it is also true when it comes to environmental issues that laws are also sometimes tools that are used, conversely, to keep government accountable. So it's kind of an interesting realm there. Some laws have teeth, most laws have teeth, some laws don't. So for example, ARFA, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which should in theory protect sacred sites, has not been terribly useful in courtroom battles, in part because it doesn't have teeth, by which I mean it doesn't have binding penalties. By contrast, the Endangered Species Act definitely does. You can get yourself in prison, or you can get yourself with a hefty fine for violating the Endangered Species Act. Oh, most definitely. And then there's a lot of laws where the teeth, in a sense, or the penalty would be what we call an injunction. Injunctions can be different things, but what we most often mean that when we are talking about environmental laws is that an injunction is basically when you take something to the court and the judge agrees with you and the judge says that such and such thing needs to stop. So for example, somebody's putting in a mine, you don't agree with the mine, you think that the approval of the mine violates Clean Water Act, you think that the government didn't properly account for that. You take that to court, judge agrees, yeah, you're right, the government really didn't account for that in its EIS, and so government puts an injunction on, either temporary or permanent. Basically, that has to stop now. Typically, it would be that has to stop until they do another analysis that actually takes this into account. So that's an injunction. An injunction could also be, for example, logging going into place, and maybe a citizen group feels like there's an endangered species there that maybe the government didn't even know about, that they then bring to the attention, potentially through a courtroom if they feel like they need to go that route. So that's a little bit about laws versus policies and some of the penalties involved. A related term that you'll hear a lot if you do any sort of environmental work, or if you do any sort of cultural resource work or cultural work, is regulations. Regulations being essentially laws that regulate an industry, that put some kind of stipulations on it. I know this is like super shocking and surprising. And then the final, but you know, a lot of times you'll hear terms like regulations and regulatory compliance, meaning that companies want to make sure that they are following the laws that they're required to follow, among other things, so that the government allows them to actually do their development project, whatever that may be. So let's say there's a group that wants to put in a large housing development, and it's going to require it's going to affect water quality in one way or another, and so regulations such as Clean Water Act, right, require them to get certain kinds of permits, like a 404 permit from the federal government, so they need to make sure they're following their regulations. Or let's say that they are using a piece of land where Endangered Species Act might come into play. They want to make sure they're following, that they're doing regulatory compliance. So they might hire, for example, an environmental consulting firm to go in there and see what the impacts of the project would be, and or if there are serious impacts, what mitigation might look like, what it might look like to avoid that, to work around it, so to speak. Like I was on a project like that one time, and we found a tiny little endangered cactus. And so I don't know whatever came of that project, but what I presume came of that is that they basically figured out a portion of the land that around these little endangered cacti to not develop. And so that's some of these different kind of terms and concepts. The final term I want you to know is agencies. And so here in the US and other places as well, I think Canada is very similar setup here, we use that to mean bodies of government which implement the regulations and the laws. And particularly we have a number of agencies such as National Park Service, EPA, Forest Service, and so on. We'll come back to that in a minute. But for now, I want to shift gears from all that boring crap and instead talk about theoretical terms, which I find exciting, and I sure hope you do too. And if you don't, if you're like the audience here that's not liking Michel Foucault transposed as a raven, then I don't know what to tell you. You still got to know these terms. No, these are, legitimately useful terms, I think, as we analyze the way our world works. It's useful to have terms, to have concepts to understand based on the research of other people, right? To not just be trying to understand every single situation entirely from the ground up, but instead have some concepts, some words in our toolkit that allow us to better understand issues. So, for example, power knowledge, or you'll sometimes hear knowledge power. And so we're not just saying knowledge is power. That's a age-old saying, but what we mean by power knowledge or knowledge power, where there's that fancy little hyphen there, it's usually people are referencing a term out of the works of a French theorist called Michel Foucault, but that a lot of other people have written about and applied this concept and found it to be useful. But it's this idea that power and knowledge, as social scientists have said from the beginning, that power and knowledge kind of work together in symbiotic ways. And more specifically, the way Foucault developed the term and people that followed after, the idea that power is based in knowledge and shapes knowledge. So as an example, the US government, when Alaska was first being colonized, when the U.S. had first purchased Alaska, one of the first things it did was do a whole lot of different exploration surveys. And in fact, that's true not just of the U.S., but when Russia first had started colonizing Alaska, right? Exploratory surveys into different areas. And as people got to know what was here as far as Alaska, the different groups, and the fur populations, that was then when Russia could start setting up sometimes voluntarily trade relationships and sometimes forced labor, i.e. slavery relationships with native populations for the fur trade. And so knowledge of the landscape allowed for an exercise of power, but power in turn shapes knowledge production, right? There are certain kinds of groups that over time became focused on within this regime of sort of resource colonialism, and other groups that didn't, right? So power shapes knowledge in terms of the Russian monopoly, the Russian fur trading companies wanted to know certain things about natives and didn't really care about other aspects of Alaska Native society, and that sort of shaped the interactions, right? And it had real-world ramifications. So, for example, wanting every group to have a decided single leader, and for that leader to be male, right, if trading was to happen. And so there was all sorts of ways in which power influenced knowledge, which in turn influenced power. So, kind of a complex, lot of different stuff going on there. You see this in environmental policy. I just gave you one example with Russian colonialism and fur trading. We can see this in contemporary times with things like pollution, right? Deciding which pollutants do or don't get regulated, as was talked about in the Melissa Checker article, is very much an activity of power, right? Of people deciding what's going to get measured and what's not, or what level we're going to measure up to. So, for example, endocrine disruptors, right? Some scientists are pretty concerned about things like endocrine disruptors from things like wastewater. That was the case where I went down and did research, but that's not something that's regulated in exactly the same way as a lot of other things. It's a lot less regulated. So, thus, can get through the system, so to speak, more. You might think of power knowledge a little bit in this way like a mesh, right? We have a mesh through which we send the whole stream of pollution, and some things get through and some things don't, based partly on the degree to which we even measure certain things or not. If we don't measure them, it's pretty hard to then tell an industry to clean up its act, or maybe encourage citizens to do things that'll help there be less pollution. If you're not even measuring it or thinking about it, it's hard to act against a certain kind of pollution. So, knowledge, power. So the government exercises knowledge power, as do private industries as well. Biopolitics is another term. It's kind of related to power knowledge or knowledge power. Biopolitics is another term from Foucault, so hey, thanks Foucault. I'm not really a big Foucauldian. There's parts of his theories that I really don't like, but he did have some really useful ideas, and this is one of them. Biopolitics is the idea that governments, back in like the medieval ages in Europe, right, and in many other parts of the world, the government very much had thanatopolitics. It had the right to kill, right? It had the right to, and to some degree the government still does. But Foucault's insight was that starting around sort of the European Enlightenment, the government started to become very interesting in regulating life, in regulating, for example, things like public health to ensure that they have a healthy population. One might argue that the lockdowns and different things associated with the pandemic were very much an exercise in biopolitics. And as that example suggests, that's not necessarily to say that that's always a bad thing, right? That would be sort of up to your own subjective opinions. I think it's good that we have things like public health agencies that can advise us on the best steps to make sure that as a population we're as healthy as possible. But from a social science perspective, it's an interesting artifact of recent history that we have things like that. I mean, not so recent. Governments have been doing stuff like that for a while now, meaning like at least a century, since things like this influenza epidemic of the early 1900s, and before that in other ways. But it's interesting that just over time governments had more and more kind of power in that way, at least in certain governments. That becomes really relevant in environmental issues as we think about the fact that when you think about something like wildlife biology, a lot of that is an exercise in biopolitics, right? It's an exercise in governments sort of tracking life, right? And trying to make sure that life properly reproduces and is healthy. And, you know, sometimes down to the really, really nitty-gritty level where we're like looking at every single one of those lives. Like, for example, when we're trying to protect the southern white rhino population or the Sumatran rhino population, which are really, really endangered. So we're tracking every single rhino and seeing how it's doing, right? And so these are just some examples to think about, some terms when we think about policy and what it is that government's doing with policy, right? A lot of times it's sort of managing these flows of knowledge and power and biopolitics. Another term that I want you to be familiar with is governmentality. So the idea of governmentality is that although the government can coerce us to do what it wants, at least under the kinds of societies we have, like the government can, you know, show up and put you in prison or something. In theory, a lot of times the government doesn't do that, but instead shapes our subjective selves, right? Convince, the way Foucault puts it, the conduct of conduct, right? Getting people to act like the way a good citizen is supposed to act. The horrific conditions in a lot of the boarding schools here in Alaska, for example, were a very good example of this, of governmentality, in the sense of trying to produce a certain kind of subject, right? Trying to influence young Alaska natives to act the way that, in the views of people like Sheldon Jackson, the school administrator at the time, to act in ways that were sort of, quote, properly American, right? Properly farming, settled in a city, things like that, Christian, speaking English. So that would be an example of that. That gets applied in interesting ways to environmental policy. There was a book a number of years ago called Governmentality. So as an example, Arun Agrawal writes a book called Governmentality, quote, Technologies of Governing and the Making of Subjects, and Agrawal talks about place in northern India. I believe the pronunciation, I'm reading it, is Kumaon, but I don't speak the local language, so I apologize if it's a mispronunciation. But basically, Agarwal charts the trajectory by which people went from, in the early 1920s, well, India was still colonized by Britain, people setting forest fires to protest against the British attempts to like set aside protected lands. Like people were deliberately setting fires and doing blockades to say like, to heck with that, don't do this, you're like infringing on our land rights and stuff, like we will straight up set fire to this stuff. By the 1990s, people in those same villages, just a generation or two later, were very much in the mind frame of conservationism. And let's be very careful with things and with these resources. And that reflects a lot of different things. I think part of what was potentially going on is a certain amount of ecotourism, but there's a lot of other things as well, as far as relationships between local villagers and the government, where eventually they came to sort of see themselves, as Agrawal points out, as sort of environmental subjects, as people that, to be proper good citizens of where they lived, needed to be caring for the forest in very specific kinds of way. Paige West, working in Malaysia, I think, Paige West talks about a similar thing in one of her famous works, Conservation is Our Government Now. Was it? Let me double check that. I'm like, conservation. Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, Paige West talks about an area of the country where government had sort of fallen into, not absence, but it was very absent in that specific rural area, and how conservation NGOs, these big environmental groups, oftentimes from outside the country even, or from more urban centers of the country, came into the area, provided funding for protected areas, bought up land to protect it, and to kind of turn it into an ecotourism kind of thing, where tourists would come and pay money to, go on a rainforest walk or something, and thereby bring money into the economy. So these conservation NGOs ended up providing a lot of employment and services to the local people. And so the quote of the book, right, conservation is our government now, that conservation NGOs sort of become their own sort of non-state state actor in this way. So that would be another potential example of environmentality, and also a good example of the fact that policy is not just something governments do, it's also in this case something an NGO was doing, a nonprofit. Hegemony is another. Oh, sorry, and I was going to say, if we want a US example of that, recycling versus composting, right? So the kinds of environmental subjects, if you grew up sort of post 80s, so I grew up in the 90s, I was born in the mid 80s, you grew up probably, especially this might be somewhat regional depending on where you grew up, but you very likely grew up thinking about recycling, right? I remember as a kid in grade school, right, the recycling campaigns and things like that, that was very big right then. So you grew up thinking of recycling as really important and sort of something you do as sort of a proper citizen. Indeed, so much so that one time I went to my aunt and uncle's house, they're a little bit older than me, and I noticed, I was asking where their recycling was, and they were really sheepish about the fact that they didn't have a recycler. And then they said something like, oh, but like we do other things for our community, like we blah, 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 blah. And, no doubt, I'm sure they do a lot of great stuff for their community. In fact, I know that they do, but it was like a funny statement. It was kind of like they were concerned that I would be judging them for recycling, which may reflect maybe I come off as environmentally judgmental. I apologize if that's so, but I think also reflects that recycling almost becomes a moral marker. But nobody, or at least most people, don't feel that way about composting, right? Composting is a wonderful thing you can do for the environment, since food waste is one of our most serious forms of waste. And yet, obviously, in some degrees, it's less serious than plastic waste, but it's still serious, right? We waste a lot of food. We waste a huge chunk of food. It was one of EPA's priority areas a few years ago. And so composting is something we can do that's protective with the food waste that we inevitably have, right? We all inevitably have a certain amount of food that goes bad in the fridge, or, we don't want to eat the crust of something or whatever. Or at least I shouldn't say all of us do. I guess that's sort of also depends on a lot of other factors, but a lot of homes do have at least a little bit of food that goes to waste. And so composting is a way to deal with that. And although I think a lot of people recognize as composting is good, some people don't even know about it. It's certainly hard to do in some areas, and it's not something that's nearly as sort of ingrained into our ethos, arguably, as recycling. So it hasn't been put into our subjectivity, our environmentality, quite like the other things. Hegemony is the idea of entrenched ways of thinking that, particularly those that serve the powerful. Comes about from a guy by the name of Antonin Gramsci, although a lot of other people have developed the idea further. You've heard me use the term eco-hegemony when those ideas are specifically related to the environment. A good example of the latter is what I'm calling here highway culture, the assumption that we need to live in communities, that is okay, acceptable, and encouraged to live in communities where we have to drive an hour to get to work, which is of course only possible because of things like highway systems and automobiles. I won't say that that's good or bad from a purely like moral level. That's a very personal decision for everybody. From a purely environmental level, that has huge impacts, right? That has huge impacts in terms of the amount of ozone coming out of people's tailpipes, the amount of smog, the amount of NOx or nitrous oxides coming out of people's tailpipes, but also things like just the pure land footprint, right? And so don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for highways. I obviously drive on highways. But highway culture is an interesting kind of hegemonic assumption in our minds, right? An assumption in our mind that that's okay and normal and accepted, that things should be so far from each other. And that's connected to other assumptions, like the assumptions of what a property should look like for an individual home. Bureaucracy. Well, of course, we all know what bureaucracy is, right? We've all been to, let's say, sort of the infamous example is like the DMV or something, right? And the sheer power exercised by folks over there, some of whom are quite nice, some of whom perhaps less so, over things like your license. But bureaucracy, actually applies to us in all sorts of different areas, as you experienced if you've ever had to. For example, contest an insurance claim. Bureaucracy need not be governmental. There are shall we say, equally frustrating bureaucracies in private industry as well. But anthropologists, sociologists have long been interested in bureaucracy, going all the way back to Max Weber. He actually applied it to religions and the ways in which religions become bureaucratized. They start with a charismatic founder, and then over time become more routinized and regulated, which to some degree is sort of necessary for their survival. But it's interesting to apply that concept of the sheer power of bureaucracy to social issues. There's been a lot of good anthropology in the last 20 years to show just how much power is exercised sort of in the margins, not by politicians per se, although certainly by politicians, but also by the quote-unquote faceless bureaucrat, right? By folks that are sort of in various lower level tiers of power and who have these big policies coming at them, and then they're the ones that actually interface with the public and like kind of interpret what that policy means and what that's supposed to look like. So as one of many examples we could think of, fish in game, right? And when you go fishing and how they choose to enforce or not enforce what you do with your fishing license, right? So one time I'd forgotten to put down, I had to run to my car for something and I'd forgotten to write down right after I caught my fish. I was pretty new to the game, and so I'd not written down the fish I'd caught yet. It's not that I wasn't going to, but I hadn't yet. And so Ranger wanted to see my card, first wild fishing game ranger I'd run into. And so, he told me basically, hey, that's a no-no, make sure you're doing it right after you get every fish. But according to policy and law, he was very much in his right to write me up and to give me a ticket, and then I would have owed a bunch of money, and that would have sucked, and potentially that would have affected my ability to fish in the future as well. So maybe a ranger is not who you initially think of as a bureaucrat, right? But there's a lot of power in the people that individually enforce these massive laws and policies, right? So bureaucracy sometimes has a life of its own. In that case, I was grateful not to owe a huge fine for something that was a fairly innocent mistake. But remember, when you fish, after each fish, write down what you got on your card. But that's a good example, right, of the way bureaucracies work, is this sort of tracking of each individual fish taken, right? Biopolitics, the careful tracking of the salmon populations. And then the final term I want to use is technoscientific means. That's a term we often use when we talk about environmental policy, to talk about sort of, there's different ways, right, of trying. We all know there's big environmental problems. There's different ways of trying to address that. Technoscientific, when somebody uses the term technoscientific, what they're usually getting at is the idea that we can solve the environmental problems using technology, using science, using better ways of doing the same thing, right? We will have electric vehicles instead of gas vehicles. We will have solar versus coal, things like that. So we're producing too much water pollution, then we will develop a wastewater treatment plant. By contrast, right, there are other kinds of avenues of change. Somebody could argue for sort of radical structural change, right? We have to totally do a society in a different way, totally redo economy, or maybe bring it down super local, right? Sort of this regionalism, biolocalism, kind of like what Mahatma Gandhi was advocating for. So there's lots of different ways of sort of advocating for change. Technoscientific implies sort of a confidence that technology and science will see our way through the environmental issues, and that we may or may not need a big reduction in consumption. Other people feel like, yes, we need a huge reduction in consumption. So you'll hear that term come up a lot because when we talk about environmental policy, because a lot of environmental policies, by virtue of the fact that they come from a sort of vested power interest, i.e. the government, they're not going to be kind of arguing for their own overhaul, right? Their own sort of doing away in massive systemic change, but instead sort of working within that structure to try to find other sorts of solutions, oftentimes which involve better technology or perhaps regulations that encourage, let's say, a certain kind of smokestack technology. Or reductions in consumption that will partly be through science, right? More fuel efficient cars, the CAFE standards. So anyways, these are all terms that are useful. I hope I haven't just put you to sleep talking about a bunch of theoretical terms, but I wanted to use that as kind of a springboard to actually talk about several different sort of mini case studies of different environmental things in the policy world that I didn't necessarily need entirely different slides on, but I wanted to kind of talk about because I think these are really useful terms to think through environmental policy. And you'll actually see them come up a little bit later in the lecture. So see you there.